Buried and ignored.
Neglected for more than 65 years.
That's how the history of the ethnic German cleansing has been dealt with.
The survivors' stories will pay homage to the 15 million people who felt it, lived it, and the many who died from it.
The forgotten genocide will now be remembered.
I'm surprised about the project because when I went to school in Germany, we rarely spoke about this.
Survivors encircle the globe. Of the fleeing survivors who came to the United States, a large number settled in St. Louis.
I came to St. Louis roughly about 60 years ago after being expelled out of my former home in Yugoslavia. But this is as far as the Danube Swabians have settled.
The ethnic Germans who lived in the mountainous borders of Bohemia and Moravia Silesia, a region near the Sudeten Mountains, settled there more than 700 years ago, when in the 13th century, King Ottokar II, along with other sovereigns, promoted German settlements in Bohemia and Moravia to develop the mountainous frontier regions. The ethnic Germans of Hungary, Romania, and Yugoslavia were known as Danube Swabian.
The term Danube Swabian was coined by Robert Seeger in 1922, in contrast to the Swabians in the southern region of Germany.
By invitation of Kaiser Karl VI, the first large trek came down the Danube River, beginning in Ulm, Germany, to the Habsburg crown lands of Hungary, to rebuild the population after the 150-year Turkish occupation.
There would be 2 more invitations to the German people. Empress Maria Theresia invited the second trek, urging more people to migrate down the Danube. Her son, Emperor Franz Joseph, would extend the third invitation in 1783, when a compromise was made to unite 2 major Habsburg realms together, forming Austro-Hungary.
And from there, they went on to some flatboats downriver on the Danube until they came into the area, the Pannonia Flats, which was the area where they settled.
The excitement of a new beginning came face to face with adversity.
All kinds of waterborne diseases decimated the population, but within 3 generations, they have created a very prosperous area. I think the original number that was given was something like 15,000, but over the years, more and more came and settled in that area.
A nice dog, and that really rips you out from it was sort of a really like almost a paradise for us kids there.
But there are always those kinds of people who are bloodthirsty, and in the German army you had very similar ones. So when all the devastation that was caused on Russia was then repaid in kind, except in Yugoslavia, the main perpetrators of the revenge were the guerrilla forces of Tito's. Tito was a Croatian communist.
In 1938, Czech President Edvard Beneš inducted a policy to expel the German minority to be executed with utmost brutality. By the time the Pusterem Conference took place, 1 million Sudeten Germans had lost their lives to wild expulsions.
Homes were built and villages grew through the many trades and businesses the ethnic Germans established. One of these villagers was Adam Martini, who was born to a woodworking family.
It was late in 44, I think it was late summer, when the partisans would come into our town and start trouble. So the town decided they're going to all move to Germany. I, of course, was only 7 years old or so at the time, and I remember that we had to leave the dog back, and the dog actually cried, I thought, you know. So we got this one very spirited horse, which was never used, you know, they always used it for parades and things, but was not used for pulling a wagon. So my grandmother, my sister, my mother and I, we were in this wagon with a big colony of car wagons.
The Martini story is commonly heard regarding the expulsion. Some fled, others were imprisoned.
As a young girl, Anna remembers how life was for her.
In the spring, and took us all out of the houses, mostly out of the big farmer houses. We were lucky we could stay because my mother used to cook for some soldiers, Russian soldier. They said, when something comes, we should go as far as we can. As far as our lake takes us, we should leave from there because it's not going to be pretty. So told us the same thing. When you have to go, go. Don't stay back because they start to kill you. They did middle of the night, the partisaner, which was there, they start shooting people. Whoever came out of the house, they just shot you right there and then.
After grammar school, my parents sent me to Grossbetschkorek to high school. And I spent 2 years there, but the second year I couldn't complete because my mom came and took me home because everything became so chaotic at home and she was afraid for my life. And in 1944, in the fall, the gypsies of our town started coming in our homes and taking whatever they pleased to have. After that, Tito's partisans came in, and they came to our homes and did the same thing.
Russian soldiers came into villages ready to terrorize.
My ancestry was there since 1668. We heard some commotion on our street. The door opened and there was a gypsy woman and a Russian soldier and a partisan. Right, they came into the house, they put a gun on our heads and said, well, out you go. They collected all the people from our road in front of us, and we had a Serbian neighbor who came in and robbed our house right in front of us. And we were neighbors for 25 years.
It was on a Sunday morning. My mother went to the 8 o'clock church services, but she came home soon all excited and crying, telling us that shortly after the services started, a soldier of Marshal Tito came in and walked up to the priest. A few words were exchanged. The priest told the people to go home, be ready in 2 hours.
Russians and the partisan preferably came in, and in one day they collected all the major people in our town who were leading citizens, about 68 of them. They collected them, beat them up severely, and they killed them.
Serbians, the partisans, rounded up whoever, anybody that was a little rich or somehow or other was maybe political.
My mother was saying, well, we're not going with the rest of the group because the father was in the army, and it was just my mother, my brother, and myself. And she said, we're gonna stay. Well, then they threw us out. They came with the guns and says, 10 minutes is all you have. So she bundled up whatever she thought, and we had to get out of there. I remember a big colony going off to one of the camps. We went Yarek, Krushivel, and Kakova. We were those 3 camps.
I was 9 years old. It was the summer of 1944. That was the beginning of the camp.
Family members were taken away, leaving spouses, parents, and children horrified.
My dad was in the army. He was called into the German army in 1942. But I didn't see my dad anymore, neither did my mom, because we did not even know if he was alive.
Never having stood on German soil did not matter to Hitler. If a man's nationality was German, he fought for Germany.
My father was forced to join the military service in fall of 1944.
The Nazi Party considered the Danube Swabians gypsies or lowlives, an embarrassment to the German heritage, so the Nazis often sent them to the front.
My father was always hiding in the, where was he hiding that he doesn't have to go to the army? He was hiding on the pigs, on top of the pigs things. They had a little stool, that's where he was hiding middle of the day. And at night he came out because nobody seen you. And then one time they found out that he was hiding there and he had to go to the army. They came with the guns, they took him, and he had to leave. He had no choice. I mean, either leave or go with them or they kill you right then. My uncle hid in the pig's manure for 6 months. Daytime, they covered himself till here. And he was hiding in the pig's manures and the cow manure which we had in the back, hiding in there because he didn't want to go in the army. They got him too.
They went through the houses. They were firing machine guns around us, and we just simply hid in the vineyards in the back of the house. And when they came to our house, they took possession.
Stalin used the word retribution to justify his demands for slave labor.
Russia requested from Tito was that he send X number of people to Russia to work in the coal mines, in other farms and wherever.
People too old or too young were left behind.
They took our people to do work, and they took them toward the front, and actually they had to dig fortifications and foxholes for the Russians.
The Serbians came and collected all the people which were left in town. The Russians made a temporary airport not too far from my house. There was a big grassy area, acres and acres. And one morning they came, everybody has to come with a shovel or a rake and report over there. Anybody from 8 or 10 years old to 70.
Strong, healthy men and women had to fill the quotas of Stalin.
The soldier took us to the train station. 55 train wagons were ready for us, for 40 people in one wagon.
And they took all the young people from 17 to 35, men and women. They took them away and they put them into a Russian labor camp.
They took the men and women to Russia. Any men that were there aged 16 to 50, they were home for whatever reason, and women also by us from 16 to 30.
Our people in their prime, primarily those from age 18 to 35, and the women from age 18 to 30. And the day after, they marched them to Apatin, from where they were deported to Russia.
Desperation humbled people to turn to anyone to keep their disappearing family together.
After they took me away, all the women were marched into the airplane hangars, which were at the edge of town, that were surrounded with barbed wire. So this motorbike comes roaring into the airplane hangar, and this soldier jumped off the motorbike, and he pointed the gun, he said, "March out." He marched her all the way to almost to our house, and then he said, "Now you run home, and don't you turn around." And so she ran home. She got to the house. My two grandmothers were there, her mother and my father's mother. And there they explained what happened. My grandmother went to the man, to that house, and begged her on her knees to please not take her daughter-in-law, because they had taken my father already. And she was a woman in her 50s. What was she going to do with two little kids? I was 4 at the time. My brother was 10 or 9. And so, okay, he said, "All right, you go home. I'll take care of it."
Pulling families apart was not the only strategy used. Constant relocation lent to the prisoners complete unrest.
They came and they said everybody that went to higher schools, come out of the road. My mom held on to me because I was away in school already. And she says, no, we stay together. I'm not going to let you go. I only have you. You stay with me. Okay, I stayed with my mom. The rest of the girls, they were shipped down to Semlin, Belgrade, and there wasn't one girl that made it.
Christmas of that year, 1944, they allowed everybody to come home. Now this was for us one of the most joyous event, because at that time we thought the Russians are gone, our people come home, and then we would go on and live in peace.
When the Russians entered, suddenly horror stories popped up that Russians had massacred whole villages. But from the stories of my mom, which were told by my stepdad to her, I knew that she was raped several times and that she was in fear for her life all the time.
Tito promised all those loyals to him that they would be given the houses of the Germans.
Gypsies came in the schoolhouse, and whatever we had, what we were able to carry in a hurry, we had to put in the middle. And or something they liked, they helped themselves. They gathered some horses, some of the elderly were put on. We had to walk to adjacent town. It was called Mamarak.
I fled our town, and I continued my high school years in Vienna.
My stepdad came from East Prussia, and he fled all the way over 1,000 kilometers. As a little child, he was 5 years old, walking the distance all the way to the west.
We got up there just about before Christmas, maybe 3-4 weeks before, with a lot of problems. So the horses were not used to stop on a hill and hold the wagon, so they would keep up. Ours would go on back. So I had the job of putting a piece of wood behind on the wheel there, and of course when the planes would come in, and sometimes they were friendly and sometimes they weren't, so we were told to jump into the ditches. But somebody had to stay by the horse because the horse was always spirited, you know. So we decided grandmother is the oldest, and she didn't know what was going on anyway. So grandmother had to hold the horse, and we all dived into these things. Actually, yeah, when I think back, there were a lot of funny parts to this survival thing, you know.
I'm decided that we're going to evacuate. First of all, because of the Russian front coming in, and second of all, being a battlefield in our area. A cousin of hers, a woman all by herself, she offered to give us a ride. As we approached the Danube River, there was more and more military crossing the Danube River, and so the civilian were not allowed. Like I said, there was no bridge, you had to be ferried back and forth. And this woman, not having any children, just didn't care for having 3 boys in that covered wagon, and she dumped our belongings onto the street, and there we were.
And the tragedy really began there. It was a hot day, dusty. We had no food, nothing to drink, except some of the food that we took along, but we were not allowed to stop. Some of the people that started lagging behind, you know, some of them were beaten as we went along. A man in front of me collapsed and died. In the ditch, a woman gave birth to a child. It was very, very sad to see that they did beat up old people.
We were rounded up. We got there, and then they said, go back and get all of your money. We want all of your money. Most of us were put on wagons, or some of us, and we went to the next town, which is only about 1.5 miles away.
The people of Yarek fled, followed by hordes of prisoners, young and old, being marched into their place of death.
There we were separated like cattle. The kids and the old people who could not work anymore then were taken by wagons to the, this is the most memorable of my camps, which I remember, which was called Yarek.
A month after the Russians came, the Russians really didn't bother us too much. Then the partisans took over. They told us just take something to eat for a day and we're going to go somewhere. They didn't tell us where. And some old people couldn't walk. They stayed behind. They beat them with the gun, you know, with the bat, and they stayed behind. They shot them right there underground. Whoever stayed behind, they didn't shot him right away, but maybe a few 100 feet, they just couldn't go. They fall, they crawl on all four. They beat them and shot them. We walked for 2 days and 2 nights. There was a few, they confiscated a horse and wagon, whatever, and they put the people on there. And they brought us to Yarek.
Then the wagon broke down with the horses, and they caught us. They put us in a concentration camp by Dachau.
They said, well, the Russians are coming west. And by Monday, at 9 o'clock, we got to be over that bridge to that next town, bigger town, which had a train. Because at 9 o'clock, they're going to blow all the bridges up. You just grab what you had, and we ran. We made it across, but just in time, you know, and we made it to the station. But eventually, we landed in Austria.
I remember a big colony going off to one of the camps. We went Yarek, Krushevil, and Gakova.
Churchill was alleged to have said, in August of 1945 in the House of Commons, that a tragedy of immense proportions is playing out behind the Iron Curtain. They could never stop moving, running, hiding, and being forced out of every place they tried to rest.
They bombed Munich bad. And then my mother said, now it's time, she says.
There were so many Yugoslav Germans from Yugoslavia because, you know, we were forced onto the Austrian people. They didn't like us either. They decided to make a big train out of it, like a freedom train. And we go back, and my father, coming out of the military, says, I don't like it here. And my grandmother was smarter on this one. She never wanted to go back. She says, it's no good down here. Well, the train was full, people singing, drinking, you know, we're going back home, you know.
The best thing for everybody is to get back home and reunite the family.
We landed up on a big train station, and we were lucky. We didn't know where that train was took us to Austria.
He put us in a railroad car, and I remember all these big adults around me, and it was a cattle car with the door open.
We went through a village named Gakova, but we had to keep going to the next village named Krushevil.
We went all the way up to Zagreb. The train stopped there, and a big voice came on and says, leave everything you have on the train and go into the train station.
The first train station we get surrounded by partisans. One of the soldiers came and took my mom off the train. They expected the worst.
Then we saw people getting off the train where we lived across the street, or they walked right into town with bundles on their back.
After a while, both of them came back. He told her, do not go back to your hometown, because all the Germans are in concentration camp of Gakova.
Well, next thing you know, they locked all the doors. Ding, 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 everywhere. And we knew by then that we are not going home.
People who were not able to keep walking were shot to death and left on the roadside.
A decision was made by the Big Three, Great Britain, United States, and Soviet Union, at the Allied Conference in Potsdam, stating that the ethnic Germans would be eliminated from Eastern Europe.
In 1946, the American war correspondent Robert Murphy said,
knowledge that the expellees are victims of a bad political decision carried out with the utmost ruthlessness and disregard for the humanities does not cushion the effect.
The work never ended. Long, hard days chained together with nothing but starvation and pain.
A few of us had to take the furniture into another house. All furniture went into that house. Then they took the linens and everything, or your shoes and your clothing, whatever you had, was then put into another house. We had to take everything apart, and if you stepped in I was in my own house, my parents' house. If you stepped onto something that you wanted to save, like say pictures, you were hit to no end. In other words, no pencils, no papers. There was nothing that you were able to take on your body.
Farmers or people who needed help used to come into the camp and they bought you like a slave. That was it. So my mother became a maid for one Serbian farmer. And I was, how should I say, I had to take care of about 20 sheep, 30 pigs, and a couple of cows. You outgrew your own shoes. There was nothing available, so you had to put rags around. I had to run across a wheat field without shoes to chase the sheep, you know.
They had 3,000 workers, but it was bombed. And we have to bring out all the dirt. 2 and 2 have to go with the car that trash out from bombing. Then they built it up, the fabric. And we have to go sometimes outside and bring the material in with the lorries, with wagonet. A big stone, you know, and they make that to sand in the fabric. Everything was hard. We have to dig them out and put it on the bag.
It was immense work.
We have no free day. Sunday, they don't know what is a Sunday. When I was weak and I couldn't do the work anymore, they put me on gardenerai. You only was sick when you have fever.
The women were marched out into the courtyard. Somebody stood in front of them and in Serbian would scream out stuff. And when he was done, they all had to take their right fist and pound the air and scream 3 times, Živio Tito, which means long live Tito. My mother was a slave like the rest of the women.
Britain's Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin commented to the Times Magazine of November 5th, 1945, "Great God, it's the height of human madness. It is a dreadful spectacle."
They took most of the people to Košivo, which was about 3 miles from Gakova, and that was then a camp for them. We were lucky, my mother and my sister and I were lucky to be chosen to go to the doctor's house and take care of the people that had been sick and could not be moved.
Work crew which was involved in horses. For about 2-3 weeks I was the water boy. I was bringing water to people.
Wherever they were placed became their home, their bed a floor, their future grim. Stalin stated during the 11th plenary session at Postrom on July 31st, 1945, "The point is not to simply take the Germans and drive them out of the country, but the Germans being put in a situation that it is most undesirable for them to live there."
When evening came, they did not let us go home. They put us in the houses next to the town hall. Because my father had a tavern and he had a lot of wine in the cellar, barrels of wine, the commandant decided that this was going to be the house he was going to have his place. They put straw on the floor, and the people had to lay side by side in each room, as many as could fit.
We were put into 2 blocks of pastor. Boys separate from girls.
On April 1st, we were loaded on trains, and from there it went to Kakawa. Because of there was no substance in the food, most of them did get diarrhea. The people, if they had to go, they just had to run in the back. There was a whole duct with the beam on there. We call them the thunder beam. The owner of the house, she ran back there, and by the time she got there, she soiled herself.
There were 4,000 of us put in this airplane hangar, and at nighttime we would fall asleep, and the mist from our breathing would rise, and in the morning it would cool down. This was in April, and it would start raining on us, literally, because we had no soap. It was very hard. There was one big room that was like 30 by 30 with 3 wash tubs for 4,000 people to wash their clothes and no soap. Our toilet facility was a ditch, a yard wide and 30 feet deep that was out in the open. If nature called, there you were. Every night we would pray, and every night we would pray for the words always were, "In God, bless Daddy, and watch out for him." Tati. And one day, I said to my mother, and it was dark, everything was quiet, we were just praying, I said to her, "Who's Daddy?" And my mother grew very silent. I knew I said something wrong. And then she said, "Don't you remember your father?"
For many prisoners, a barn became home.
The bridge.
And no heating.
It was awful cold.
And that night we slept between horses. We didn't have anywhere to sleep, so the soldiers told us to go in the stables. It's warm. The horses didn't step on us or nothing.
Our sleeping quarters was a house, and you had a bedroom, and sometimes like a regular bedroom, but there were up to 18, 20 people in there, and you had straw on the floor. There were about 14,000 people of us there. And if you tried to leave, you were shot, period, all right? And that was it. That was the start of Jarek.
We went to the first concentration camp, which was in Croatia. The name was Krnja. They wanted to take me away because my sister was too young, but I was 8 years old. And they wanted to re-educate us, to make us little communists or whatever, I don't know. But they would catch us during the day, and then at nights they would throw us in this one house. Got dark, we would go right through the window and come back again, And eventually they gave up on it, they left us with the parents. But they took my father away.
Constant hunger pushed them to desperate measures.
In the summer, there was alfalfa patches in the garden, and there were some bugs flowing on top of your soup. Some of us were glad we had little meat.
We got barley soup with barely anything in it, and sometimes we got pea soup with maggots in it. At one time, we caught a cat and killed it and cooked and ate it.
In the beginning, we used to use anything but came and crawled. We got what we call a linsen soup with some worms crawling on top, piece of bread, twice a day, and that was it.
When the policemen, after lunch, they ate watermelon. And sometimes 200-300 people would wait. They throw down the green stuff from the first floor.
The husks from the bean, dry shelled beans, but they used to feed the cows. They give it this, cooked in water.
I was a big chubby thing, and this in half a year I was down to very skinny,
46 was so bad, there was no food. After work, I walk in the kitchen and was helping, peeling potatoes, and then I stole, I put it in my pocket.
We were sold every single day as laborers. At that time, I was also 14, and we had to go to work on the fields. But that wasn't so bad, because you could always find something to eat. Whatever grew on the fields, without them looking at us, without them seeing it, we always put something in our mouth and turned around and tried eating it, because they always were there with their machine guns, with their guns, and hitting people if they wouldn't walk fast enough, and they just stood there and died.
But there wasn't enough food because all what he got paid for was in food. And so I had to go to some farmers and tended cows for food also.
They played soccer afterwards. Shortly after, I was told there's a team that always lose. If I do good, I will get a big reward. After the game, the opposite team wanted to know who is that goalie. So my team said he's our prisoner. My teammate forced my mouth open. I remember it's called Hungarian Freilica. They're very hot peppers. 6 of them forced me. That was my reward. Women would give their jewelry, wedding rings, anything they had, in exchange for food. We had to hide. Even our own people would turn us in to get a sandwich.
Every day, when it was time for my mother to come, I'd go to the gate, and the first thing out of my mouth was, "What do you have to eat?" We had hardly any food, and if it wouldn't have been for my mother and all the other mothers, I think we children would have all died.
My grandmother had spotted an outhouse. It was attached to the back of the barn in the back. That was the only, and I was so skinny, I fit through the seat. Here I am, and my grandmother says, "Well, we're gonna lay a couple of boards of this garbage there, you know, and you go through there in, and then you bring the potatoes to there, you know," and they were there. They put a couple of boards again there, and then I just rolled them out, and they were outside. And when I heard a step or somebody stopped outside, I said, "Oh, they're coming!" Like, I would go and I would dive in there, and sometimes I miss. My grandma said, "I clean you," but I never got rid of that smell, even when I was cleaned, you know.
I had 2 grandmothers. The 2 of them had to cook for them all night. We wouldn't touch the 2 grandmothers. And we weren't there. My mom was hiding too. So they left those 2 women alone because they cooked for them. And when they had enough, and they had enough drinking too, they fell asleep wherever they stood. So next door to us, the lady opened the house for us. She hid us behind our big ovens, how should I say, where they cooked inside in the winter, and put lots and lots of blankets on top of us. So we slept all day. The next night, the same circus began.
My mother used to open the windows and stick us children outside the window to get something, steal like the potatoes or whatever we could, bring it in by the windows, put them in a little belly stove we had there. The soldier used to come in and they sticked underneath looking for the potatoes and things that we hid it in there. And when they caught us, we got beaten up.
There was right next to a police station, a storage room. So for 2.5 nights, we were able to steal a lot of wheat. When you're desperate, you're going to die anyhow.
They used what they had and found uses for what they could find.
What was the most valued possession? Clothing they had. And you would never guess what it is. It's shoes.
We got to pick out a pair of shoes that I don't know where they got all those shoes from.
But they were used, you said.
But they were used, yeah.
Twine and needle become probably the most important. A comb was the next most important. Comb yourself, that some of the lice from your head would go on a paper, white sheet to kill them. However, the aches always keep hatching out. A hinge from the door, and put a little stick in to use for a hatchet to cut some of the limb. Some of us made our own music with a comb and a paper.
We were lucky that we had my aunt, and they came also to Kakapa, and they had stuff with them, like extra blankets and so on, and stuff like that, maybe extra clothes.
I had things I played with were strings, were buttons on a string. My brother taught me how to make mud bombs. You'd make a nice, take mud and you make a nice big round ball and you stick your thumb in it and you spit in it, and then you find a nice little place and you slam it down and it would explode. We had no shoes. My cousin was really good at knitting booties, so my mother had given me a pair of booties and said, don't lose these, these were our shoes.
The best chance you had was if you had a profession. If you were a shoemaker, a tailor, especially a butcher. Because a butcher usually could steal something, and the most valuable thing you could buy that time is what you hate the most, fat. You cannot live without fat. If you had a kilo of bacon, boy, you could do all kinds of things with that. You gave your wedding ring, your earrings, that usually money we didn't have. So that was our currency.
They took us to City Hall one day, and whatever you had on your body was taken off your body, and it was a big pile of clothing. They took one dress or whatever it was, threw it to you, whether it fit or not, that was yours. No hot water, we had to keep clean. They had that pump that you had to pump up and down, and then water came out. We washed ourselves there, and you know with what? We gathered red stones which were very smooth, and that was our soap. And they came at night and checked our feet. If the feet were not clean, they hit you so hard the next day you had to go to work, you couldn't even walk.
I was able to win a couple of coins, filler coins, 20 filler coins, and I would make rings out of them.
The Benesh Decree, Article 1. Any act, the object of which is to aid the struggle for liberty of the Czechs and Slovaks, is not illegal. Any violent act, including rape and the murdering of children, is sanctioned. The guards watched every move. Their only order? Shoot to kill.
I was always too scared to go out of the concentration camp because there was guards all around and people got shot regularly.
You had to crawl through the guards, most of the time in the nighttime, to get to Temmering. And there we bet, you know, you were lucky if you got a piece of bread or a piece of, you know, a bacon or anything like that. And my God, you know.
But the partisans were relatively smart in one way. Okay, they let the people go out, but when they came back, they catch them because that was additional food for their table.
And at night, we rest on the field. Where do we go? You see like steam coming from the ground. That's where we're gonna go. The steam was coming from piles of horse manure and cow manure. And we go in there, we dig a hole, and we cover ourselves. Oh, nice and warm. We didn't mind the stink. It stunk, but we covered ourselves and we warmed up.
Well, they came through a vineyard. And I don't know, one of the kids must have made a noise, and the guard woke up and called, "Stoy!" Well, boy beside me panicked, got up and ran, and he got shot. Then the next one got up And he got it in the arm, so he died a couple of weeks later.
And they shine. They can see for miles. And they shine. We see the shine coming, we lay down flat. They spot you, they come on horseback. And they catch you. And they beat you. And they lock you up in the cellar for 3 or 4 days. No food, no water, no nothing. People die around you.
It was, you know, you were not allowed to put fire on. If they saw you had fire, which they were very particular about it, they came and they punished you. They locked you up for 3-4 days without drinking and eating, and when you came out, you were too weak, you died. You sometimes were not allowed to cross, you know, they were on one side of the street and I was on this side, so we played together, kids. The guard was on one end. If you crossed, they used to shoot at you. You were allowed to cross from, I think, from 8 to 9 and from 11 to 12, said Crack. Well, I learned how to keep time by that. One guard shot at me.
Then one day they came to the camp, they took us in a wagon, put us in a big hole, and they had to strip ourselves. They had creosote. We had to wash ourselves with that stuff. And one woman did a mistake. She got it in her face. She was so burned. She looked horrible.
It was, and people who went like to the nearby farms and got caught, they got severely punished. They put people in the basements for days, beat them up, hardly nothing to eat. When they came on out in daylight again, it looked like they aged 10 years in a week.
My father's made a Christmas tree for all the people in camp, how he took a piece of wood and they got branches from shrubs and he stuck it in there and he fashioned the Christmas tree in the Christmas Eve of 46. To decorate it, they hung dyed wood shavings. All the women and men gathered around this little tree and sang Christmas songs. And the guards watched with them and how everybody cried, remembering what it was like.
My grandfather came in. He spoke the language very well because we had a business. These Serbian folks, they knew what we had in the house. They also knew that we were business people. And my grandfather had a big winery. So they all came for the wine, and they all came for the whiskey, and they were all drunk. Some of them said, oh, there are 2 young girls in the house, a young woman. That's enough for all of us. So at that time, my grandfather made the decision. He rescued my mom and hid her. And all of a sudden, there were noises in every house, and screams, and fires. And people came from the Serbian side, and they robbed us. And then you heard the women screaming because they were raped. Daytime came. We didn't go in our house. We seen from the back. Those soldiers were laying all over the place, all over the courtyard, over everything, drunk. The Serbs sang songs. The people that were brought to the place that my grandfather helped to dig a big, big hole, they were stood there and shot into that hole. My grandfather came home one day to us. At that time we were still in our homes, and he said, children, I want to tell you something. This is going to be true what we heard. We dug out a grave where the whole town fits in. The first night in our town, if I think correctly, 79 people took their own lives. There was one family a couple of houses from us, 2 young girls. They were not as, we were kids yet, but they were maybe 20, 22 years old. The grandparents and the parents, they all hung themselves because they had to witness the girls being raped.
So the Russians would always respect the churches. And there's some famous stories that a Russian officer in the First World War came to the church and wrote in Russian letters on it, please do not enter this building, it is a house of God. The Germans had killed over 20 million Russians. This was a completely different war than the First World War. This was a genocidal war. When the Russian soldiers entered, they wanted revenge.
Their suffering was far beyond what a person could take. Sorrow followed them, always waiting for its chance.
So my mother went to our well, took a cup that was always standing there, and then brought him water. After he drank and gave it back, we went inside, and my mother went to the well to put back the cup. She took a drink from the cup, and then she gave some to me because I most likely asked for it. And but a few weeks later, we came down with typhoid fever.
My brother was contracting typhus, and when you have typhus, one of the signs is that your mind goes. So now in order to keep the typhus people separated from the others so they don't all get sick, they have set up a house. Mostly the lack of salt is part of that illness. So my grandmother asked me to beg for salt. So we went for about 7 hours walking to a town, go for about 2 hours begging. And I had a little pouch on my neck, and ever so often I got a spoonful.
In concentration camp, we were totally deprived of salt. Your body needs salt. People got blind. They tried to make you sick any which way they could.
So the first sickness what came was typhoid, and then diphtheria, and what was it? Oh yeah, dysentery, you know, what we call in plain words, the runs.
There I had such bad eye infection, boils that would appear and pop open and heal and reappear, and that was all because of the malnutrition.
Everybody had boils coming out, you know, pus, big, like 2 inches across. I still have scars on my foot. I only had a few, but some people, some kids suffered terribly. This is from the malnutrition.
There was one little kid there at the infirmary. He had scurvy so bad that that it rotted through his cheek. He had a hole there. And when they gave him milk to drink, they held his mouth shut and poured the milk in there.
Sickness was prevalent, but the survivors have many other stories to tell.
They took all the orphans, which I was an orphan, of course, but I did have somebody taking care of me. They took the orphans and took them to the southern part of Yugoslavia into a communist orphanage. They raised those kids as Serbians.
There was a girl that came into our home. We became friends because I was the only guy actually that would talk to her. She asked me if I can help to clean her lice. There was a big scab on there, so I lifted the scab up there, and there was pus underneath, and the lice crawling in the pus there, and I was so scared. I returned the pus, I put it back on top of the head, and even today I am still, it still affects me emotionally.
We walked and walked for about half an hour, till we found a farmer. And my mother knocked on the door and she says, if we can stay in the stall where the cows there is, that we have a little. She says, I have my children, if we can stay here. So they says, oh, he says, the Austria used to call us the Sksindel. Yeah, the Sksindel, that means, you know, bad people, like, I don't know how should I say it in English. Do you know how to say it?
Scum of the earth.
Yeah, scum of the earth, or whatever they called us. And the first day was Christmas Eve, which my mother used to feed the cow, milk the cow, and all that. That was our first meal, which we had in about 3 or 4 months.
And there we had to be in a big hall, and then we were sent to this big hall. I don't know if those were dance halls or what at the time, you know, but huge rooms. And people laid down straw, slept down straw. And they had big lists on the walls where the natives could come and see if any of their relatives made it to the West.
They put us in the beautiful city of Dresden. 600,000 people lived there, and 600,000 refugees were there. This all changed by February 13, 1945. Without any warning, about 1 o'clock in the morning, a lot of airplanes, hundreds of them came back, not to bomb, but to throw chemicals down. Now that chemical, when it came down, it didn't matter if it was iron, if it was concrete, if it was, in fact, the streets melted. It was so hot. I mean, everything was inflamed. It was hell on earth. And people were outside because there was no warning. So even the people started running around and burned. The zoo, the elephants, tigers, lions came out on fire. It was chaos. Lucky for us, we were close to a park, and through the park we were able to get to the Elbe River. Even though it was frozen, there was enough water on the side where we could throw it in our faces, because that fire created like a lot of heat. I mean, unbearable heat. And then it also created like a wind. It's almost like tornado-like. And last of all, it sucked out the oxygen. We suffocated. So that water really helped us.
Some of the harsh memories were too hard to hide.
Fleet of trucks from America. And this was a gift from the American government. The next day, all the tires were missing. People used it for their shoes, for soles. They found out my father was a cabinet maker, and all of a sudden he found himself working for the bosses to build houses for the better workers, the civilians. So they would be making windows and doors, and they'd hang them, and then overnight they would come and steal it. And he said, if you didn't know what chop-chop meant, which means steal, you couldn't live.
We had a big snowstorm. We had to shovel out a locomotive. I thought this was the end of my life. I had no energy left, my body was weak, and my spirit very low.
A woman and a man were taken, and the grandmother had their 18-month-old son. And as they were being put on the train, the grandmother quick shoved the baby into the car with them, and he ended up being in their camp, this child. And when my father told me this broke my heart. The baby grew up. He started to talk, and he was like a toddler, walk, and everybody was around this child in Russia. And one time, the woman who brought their food, which was a wagon where the sour borscht was on, a big tub, she brought her children along. There were 2 little kids. And the baby never saw children. And my father said he walked up to the children and touched them and didn't know what they were, that they were little like him. And all the men and women surrounded this child, these children, and they all had the same thought. They thought of their own children and how they were worried about what was going on with their children.
There were also toys thrown, and they had explosives in, and my mom always said, please don't ever pick anything up.
When you have seen a mother kissing her children for the last time and then throwing her into the icy water of a bridge and then jumping behind them, killing all her family and herself, then you know what it means to be in a war.
The only thing I remember that was sad for me, like Autumn says, when the wagons came by and got the dead people. I remember a little girl, they had put in a box, and it was springtime with all the blossoms. It was so pretty. And then all the people would go and hold their hands like this when they prayed. Well, every time I seen my mother do this, I made her hands go away, because I thought she's gonna die. You know, being little, I didn't realize until she found out why I was doing that, and says, "No, I'm not gonna die. I'm just praying." You know.
And my mother, I think, because she would be cooking for the young kids, since my sister was very young, you know. And there were 200 kids under 2 years old. And from the 200 kids, 3 survived. And one of them was my sister, which that made an impression on me, you know.
To recognize when somebody was died beside you. Interesting, I learned to see it. We were completely infested by lice. You know, you couldn't keep yourself clean. When the lice, you could see the lice leaving a dead body. It was like a streak going along, coming towards you. That sure meant the other guy was dead because they didn't have any blood to get out of it anymore.
When they caught us, we got beaten up about it, the children and things. And then little children died. They take those little children who passed away. They throw them in a little shed.
First, the kids died. The smaller kids died. And up to maybe 7 or 8 years old, between 8 and 10 or 12 were the best survivors.
The age of a baby to 3, 4, 5 years old, there were about 1,400 of them in there. And they were the first ones to go. And then the old people. My grandmother, both of them were there. And when the old people gave up the hope and naturally with nutrition what we had, they started to die in droves.
When they die, they put them in a room, you know. When they had 8 persons together, they put them on a wagon, one this way, one this way, and 8 men carried them out.
They grabbed them by the head and by the feet, them right on the wagon. I followed that wagon along.
Bodies were thrown into mass graves, then they poured over a layer of white lime.
The more people died, the higher we stacked them, because we couldn't keep up.
They threw it in there, and that was kept open until they had enough. Covered it up with about a foot of the topsoil if they had it. And when the spring and summer came along, you could smell it from a mile. It's still in my nose. I can smell dead meat, I think, better than anything else.
And my grandfather, he was in the 80s. After we got there, it didn't take too long, my grandfather died.
My grandmother died of syphilis.
When my first grandmother died, she was right in the spring of 1945.
In February, my grandfather died.
And next spring, my mother died.
In November, my 16-year-old sister died.
Then my second grandmother followed about, it was 2 months later on.
There were sometimes 100 people that died a day.
My sister the same way. She died a little bit later.
And my 10-year-old sister held her in her arms when she died.
Grandparents would give their food to the children, so then the grandparents died, and then all these children were all over the town.
And then I was all by myself over there, 10 years old. There were 5 boys. They were between 3 and 8 years old, or 9. And when we played at home, everybody wanted to be their friend. Because the boys always stuck together, the brothers. You didn't want to get beaten up at that 5. And one by one, from the youngest to the oldest. They died. Few weeks apart. Nobody made a box for the oldest.
When it felt like all was lost, a kind gesture would bring a moment of pleasure to the prisoners who were losing faith in humanity.
In 1948, we were more or less scattered out. I believe once a year we even got rubber boots.
When the representatives came from the United Nations, the communists in Czechoslovakia went to extremes to hide the horror being inflicted on the ethnic German children.
Lived this Serbian woman. Now, I roamed the streets. I could do whatever I wanted. But across the street was something very beautiful. A huge pear tree. There was a garden. And there was pears all over it. I remember standing at the gate and trying to think how I was going to open the gate, run to the tree, grab a pear, and run back without being noticed. And I'm thinking so hard on this. All of a sudden, this woman comes out of the house and she's repeating after me. She keeps on saying this over and over, these words, and I wasn't afraid of her. She opened the gate, she took me by her hands, she walked me over to the pear tree, gave me a pear. So that's something else to me. Motioned me to come with her. I stood in front of the door. She went in, she came out with a big piece of bread. And she gave me that piece of bread and the pear and sent me off.
In April, the church bells did ring for a long time. No one did know why. But then the rumor spread that the war has ended.
Through the night, sometimes we have to work on the bridge outside. I remember it was midnight, the sky was so clear, the stars and the moon were shining, and it was so bitter cold. And we were all in a circle, and we were singing what we can.
Fancy men dressed with suits and ties coming and looking us over. They put us all, line us up over there. Somebody said, "These are people from the UN." They're going to help you. There was thousands of kids over there. I don't know what happened to the others. I was among a group of a few hundred. They put us again in, freight train, and they bring us to Grospečkerek. They put us in a spanking new hospital there, everything bright. The first time we seen a flushing toilet, flush toilet, clean beds, sheets on it, pillows, food. Doctors come, check you out, this and that. We stayed there for about 2 months. They put us to school. They start off in second or third grade, with the little kids, because we couldn't speak the language. So they put us with these kids, and in no time at all, within months, we could speak the language.
There were some nice times when the kids all went and played in the big square in town. I really liked that. We did all these little games. When you were young, you don't think of all the bad things. You don't even realize what has happened around you. You just go and do what at the moment what is fun.
We were again in a vineyard, and a guy comes along with a bicycle, very dressed, black, a uniform, hat, and he says, "Ah!" And it turned out he was an Austrian mailman. And he says his obligation was to report us, so the Russians shipped us back to Yugoslavia. And then he looked at me and he said, "No, not going to do it." Took in his house, and he didn't have much. Gave us to eat. And then he gave us some money. And he had a friend in the next little village who had a little truck, and he was supplying vegetable and all kinds of stuff into the what we call the English zone. Austria was divided in 4 zones for the Allies. He said, "Well, go to him, he'll take care of you." So whatever happened to me, usually you think, you know, there were always bad people. Well, I learned there are other people around too.
We found out that my father was still alive, and he was living in Munich, Germany, where we eventually got there too, and I lived in bombed out Munich for 2.5 years until my dad and mom we decided to come to America. We came to this station. This is Union Station. This is where most of us at the early times, we come on boat across to New York, and then we come by train to Chicago, and we landed in Union Station.
My father found out where we were. He was in Hungary, and he also paid those guys to pick us up. And we did the same bridge, as Autumn says, that little bridge. I still see it now. It was dark, and you had to go across. It wasn't many wider than this. Big ditch, and you go over it, you know. One time I remember I had my apron full of berries, because that's what the people gave us, you know. So, and then we went to Austria. We were able to go across the border at nighttime.
When I hear my husband is still alive, that was the first thing when I came out the train.
While we were in Germany, we found my cousin, the family that took care of me, whose son was in Germany. He was returned to Germany, and in one of the camps that you had to go to register, we found him. So that was another miracle.
So again, when you go back, and some of those things flash back.
When you come right down to it, I don't know how we survived. I really don't know.
Sometimes you get nightmares yet still on what happened, you know. And I just hope my children don't have to go what we went through.
This story is not over.
The pain still exists.
Even today, the ethnic Germans are still fighting for their rights.
When the Russians overwhelmed the German army in 1944, they have taken over, and that was the regime that was going on until the 1980s when the Berlin Wall fell.
Now you might say, this was fair. I mean, how can a child be punished for something? But I think that's the craziness of nationalism. You don't see the person anymore. You see the nationality.
Tito turned out to be a maverick communist. He was not exactly a favorite brother of the Communist Party because he was marching to the sound of his own drummer, not that of Stalin. They were released into East Germany, not into Yugoslavia. Because had they been released into Yugoslavia, they would have found absolutely nothing of what they have left behind, because they were totally disenfranchised, dispossessed, and there was nothing to come home to.
Now, the people who told me stories, they were from Pomerania, some from Romania, and some, of course, from what today is the Czech Republic. And so, I mean, this was a fate that happens all over Eastern Europe. And I even met some who lived inside Russia, so-called Volga Germans, who never, I mean, even were under Hitler's rule. They always remained under Soviet Union rule, and they were deported to Siberia, into camps, only because they were German. One of my friends, very good friends, he works right now in the Ukraine, in a village where they try to resettle Russian Germans and to prevent them to go to Germany, which is a little bit odd. But you have to keep in mind, the refugees are not welcome in Germany. None of my ancestors were welcome. Most German families have some stories like that, some